The rain had ended, but the land still glistened with water and sorrow. The battle of Hydaspes had been won, yet for Alexander, victory never meant rest. His dreams were too vast, his ambition too consuming. He stood at the edge of the Punjab, the farthest any Macedonian had ever come, gazing eastward. Beyond these lands, he was told, lay vast kingdoms even richer and mightier, lands where the sun rose from the edge of the earth. To others, it was a myth. To Alexander, it was destiny. But his men no longer shared his hunger. They were scarred, weary, and homesick. Years of marching had drained their spirits. They had crossed deserts that killed thousands, climbed mountains where the air froze the lungs, and faced enemies that never surrendered. Yet Alexander's gaze burned with the same fire it had in Greece, in Persia, in Egypt. He could not stop. The world still waited to be conquered. After the victory over Porus, Alexander spent months organizing the new territories. He respected the courage of the Indian king and allowed him to remain as ruler, now a loyal ally. But beyond Porus's land lay reports of another mighty empire, the Nanda kingdom, whose rulers commanded armies of thousands of elephants and millions of soldiers. It was said that the Ganges River flowed through cities of gold and temples of unimaginable beauty. To Alexander, this was a challenge he could not ignore. He wanted to march there, to fight one last great battle that would make him master of all Asia. But his soldiers had reached their breaking point. The rains of India turned the ground to swamp. The food was strange, and the endless jungle buzzed with insects and disease. Their armor rusted, their horses weakened, and morale slipped with every passing day. Around the campfires at night, the men whispered that they had gone far enough, that even the gods would not dare venture further east. Still, Alexander pushed onward. He led a smaller force deeper into the Indian plains, subduing tribes and local rulers who resisted. Each battle was fierce, but victory always came. Yet with every step, his men grew more restless. The strange customs, the unfamiliar stars, and the constant rain began to feel like a curse. At last, they reached the banks of the Hydaspes River, now known as the Beas, the easternmost boundary of Alexander Tia's conquests. Beyond it lay the lands of the Nanda Empire. The king called his officers together, standing before them with the same fire that had led them across the world. His cloak was damp, his armor dull from months of travel, but his voice still carried the power that had once inspired thousands to follow him into the unknown. He told them that the world's edge was close, that glory greater than any ever achieved lay beyond this river. But when he looked into the eyes of his generals, he saw no reflection of his own ambition. The men were silent, their faces weary. Finally, Conus, one of his trusted commanders, spoke what all were thinking. They had marched for 8 years, he said. They had fought every kind of enemy in every kind of land. They were no longer young, and their hearts longed for home. At first, Alexander refused to listen. He raged, pacing before them, his temper flashing like the storms above. He spoke of honor, destiny, and immortality, of how the gods themselves had chosen him to conquer the world. But the army remained unmoved. For the first time, Alexander faced something he could not defeat, the exhaustion of his own men. That night he wandered alone to the river bank. The rain fell softly, and the sound of frogs and insects filled the air. He stared into the dark waters of the Hydaspes, imagining the unknown world beyond, the one he would never see. For hours he stood there, torn between his dream and his reality. At dawn, he made his decision. He returned to his camp and announced that the army would turn back. His men erupted in cheers, tears of relief running down faces hardened by war. To mark the end of his eastward march, Alexander built 12 great altars along the river, symbols of his conquest and devotion to the gods. It was his way of declaring to the heavens that though he could not go further, he had reached the limits of the known world. The march home began, but it was no easy journey. Alexander decided to return not by the same road he came, but through the southern deserts of Gedrosia, what is now part of Pakistan's Makran coast. He wanted to explore, to chart new lands, and perhaps punish those who had resisted his rule. It was a decision that would test his army's endurance beyond anything they had faced before. The deserts of Gedrosia were merciless. The heat burned like fire, and the sand swallowed men and horses alike. Water was scarce. The few wells they found were brackish or dry. The men marched by night and buried their dead by day. Even Alexander, ever proud, walked beside his soldiers rather than ride, sharing their thirst and suffering. When one of his men found a small helmet full of water and offered it to him, Alexander poured it onto the ground, saying, "If my men cannot drink, neither will I." That single act rekindled their spirit, but it could not save them all. Thousands died before they reached the sea. When the survivors finally emerged from the desert, ragged and half-starved, they looked less like an army and more like ghosts. Yet even in ruin, Alexander's will did not break. He reunited with the fleet he had ordered to sail down the Indus under Admiral Nearchus, determined to map the coast and establish trade routes between India and Persia. It was one of the first great voyages in recorded history, a journey that expanded the ancient world's understanding of geography. After reuniting with his fleet, Alexander turned west, retracing his steps through the lands he had conquered. Along the way, he rebuilt cities, punished rebellious governors, and rewarded loyal ones. But something in him had changed. The man who had once seemed invincible now appeared restless, haunted. He had conquered everything, and yet he felt an emptiness he could not fill. When he reached Susa in Persia, he tried to unite his empire more firmly. He arranged mass marriages between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, even taking a Persian bride himself. He encouraged his men to see Persians not as enemies, but as equals. Alexander's army, once bound together by glory, now began to fracture under the weight of its own success. Many officers grumbled that their king was no longer one of them, that he had become more Eastern than Greek. Rumors spread that he now demanded divine honors, that he believed himself a god. Whether that was true or not, one thing was clear. Alexander was no longer marching against external enemies. His new battles were within. Years of conquest had changed him. The boy who had once looked up to Achilles now stood as a legend in his own right, yet he seemed unable to find peace. His eyes, once filled with purpose, now carried the shadows of all he had lost: friends, soldiers, and his beloved horse Bucephalus. Even Hephaestion, his closest companion, would soon die, breaking Alexander's heart completely. By the time he returned to Babylon, his empire stretched from Greece to Egypt to India, the largest the world had ever known. But it was fragile, held together by his charisma alone. He began planning new campaigns, perhaps to Arabia, perhaps even to the distant western seas. The fire that had driven him since childhood still burned, but his body was worn. In June 323 BC, only months after returning to Babylon, Alexander fell ill. Some said it was fever, others whispered of poison. For days he lay silent, unable to speak, surrounded by his generals. When asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest." Those were his final words before death claimed him at the age of 32. The man who had never lost a battle, who had crossed continents and defied the odds at every turn, was gone. His empire would soon fracture among his generals, the successors, who would fight for decades over his legacy. Yet Alexander's name would never fade. His journey through India, his clash with Porus, his longing to reach the world's edge, and his march through the Gedrosian Desert became symbols of human willpower and ambition. He had not just conquered lands, he had expanded the boundaries of what men believed possible. Even today, when the wind sweeps across the plains of the Punjab, or the sands of the Makran coast, the echoes of his army still seem to whisper through the ages, the sound of a dream that refused to die. Alexander the Great had reached for eternity, and though his life ended too soon, his story would live forever, written across the map of the world he changed.